Welcome to episode 9 of the She Built This podcast with Samantha Charwood. Today's episode is the myth of fragility and understanding that aging doesn't actually have to mean the end of anything, really. The reality is very, very different and vastly incomparable to how we view aging, I believe. So if we think about the nature of getting older and what that might mean. And when we think about it in our mind's eye of people we know who are older, for example, and if you think about that, chances are there is a vast difference between some people who you know are older and unable to move around freely, and then there'll be other people for whom that is simply not the case and they live very active lives. The reality is that the way that we treat aging matters right from your 20s, 30s, 40s. The influences you have around you, the people that you view and how you view them, but also how you view yourself. And having a narrative of aging equals fragile will inevitably lead to that being the truth, I believe. And actually, if you can turn that on its head and actually understand the nature of biology and that there is this thing called bioplasticity, which gets thrown around. It is true. Like everything continues to change forever. And how that happens is within your control to a certain degree. Now, you're going to have external circumstances that you can't control. That's obvious. However, fragile comes from probably a lack of exposure to things, a lack of load, a lack of experience. So, actually, if you can work it backwards, and if I'm speaking to you now and you are not at, in your sort of late 80s, 90s, then you have a lot you can influence. And if you're coming back to sort of maybe 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there are things that you can definitely do to adjust the trajectory of how the rest of your life is going to pan out, even into your 80s. Like, my dad is 80, and I can see in him how actually daily activity, lifting, moving, and all of those things actually play into a narrative of not being fragile, of being able to stand on your own 2 feet, being able to be stable, and having the exposure to lots of different environments and lots of different experiences that essentially expand your nervous system. So anytime you find, I'm just thinking back to, within the Sampira course, we talk about the capacity code. And essentially that's what we're talking about, is if your capacity is limited, i.e., you limit your capacity by not experiencing certain things. So, for example, there may have been a point in your life when you had back pain, and so you stopped lifting heavy things or lifting things off of the floor. Now, chances are that back pain came and went. It's certainly the tissue damage would have progressed, and it would have hopefully got to a stage where lifting heavy things would be absolutely fine. But maybe you didn't continue that behavior because you were a little bit cautious or a little bit anxious about doing that. Now, over a period of time, what happens is your capacity for that shrinks. So what we need to do is to gently expose you to this environment and these changes over a period of time so that your capacity for that that behavior, that movement pattern is expanded. And so by continuing to do that, your capacity gets bigger, and actually the chances of you being fragile as you get older become less, because you're constantly challenging what the body is capable of doing. And I think if we can do that with our bodies and our minds, and to essentially to our hearts as well, really, is that, over a period of time, we all get exposed to being hurt and being perhaps having certain, maybe we betrayed or maybe we lack trust in people. And do you see how, like, if you never ever trust anyone ever again, that capacity for trust becomes less. Whereas actually, if you are, cautiously kind of, you put yourself out there and you invest in other people, you're not going to get it right all the time, and people are going to let you down. But if you never expand that experience, then you're not going to do it. And exactly the same happens within the body. And also, what I would love to for you to try and make the leap of is to see both, is to see that your trust in yourself has to go as well. So you have to go with that trust that you are able to do it, that you are able to do that, have that experience and improve. So when we look at this, so I use the sovereign integration method within my work, where we talk about body, heart, mind, and soul being part of the whole picture of health, because there it's so multi-layered. And whilst you're thinking of fragility maybe from a body perspective, but also that if you can think of fragility in terms of emotional capacity, in terms of spiritual capacity, in terms of mental capacity, like if you are, lots of people these days, I love seeing it, where people take a huge jump in kind of doing the Sudoku stuff, and they do Wordle and Worldle and all the other 100 different types of things that you can do with those, and it's so good. And that's one aspect. And doing your body with stuff is another aspect. And just being able to be open and press the gates of the nervous system in every direction, so that when we come to aging, it becomes less about less and more about more, which I know sounds, I don't know where that came from, but it essentially is about more. Like, you get to have more experience, you have everything to draw down on, you know what you're capable of, you have trust in yourself because you've built that capacity, and that you actually then aging becomes a more kind of expansive process, and that actually, rather than your world getting smaller, it actually gets bigger, because the fragility part, the sort of the narrative that we've had going on around small, fragile, weak, feeble, this thing we have in our minds of fragility is actually not true. And I'm not saying that we're going to be our strongest, biggest, best self at the age of 105. But what are we judging fragility on? So we can think about fragile as in body, heart, mind, soul, building that entire capacity, building that up on all levels. So when you're trying a new experience, what is that feeling like on all of those levels? And how can you go the next level on one of those levels, maybe, that actually expands it, so that you become a bigger version of yourself, maybe not necessarily in body wise, but in capacity, that you hold more, that you can shore up things. I always think about one of the things I was listening to the other day about grandparents, for example, and being able to be this kind of really regulated, steady component of a family, as opposed to something that kind of adds more drama or adds more unease or is unsettling. That we get to be these, really steady rocks within the family. And that, I believe, comes from being able to be not fragile in heart, mind, and soul. And actually, when then you bring that in, your body responds to that frequency of how you feel when you are holding that energy of steadiness, of rock solid. And can you see also then, when you start talking about steady, and we think about like being steady on your feet, being stable, all of that narrative sits then that you are, that you can be those things that are all the things that fragile does not conjure up. Not weak, not easily moved, not unstable, or one breath of wind and you're gone, when actually that's not the truth. That's not how aging happens, I don't believe. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on how this plays out for you and whether this rings true. And I know this is a slightly strange meander through aging, but I think it's really important because when you have this idea in your minds as to what you're heading towards, and I don't know if you kind of think back or think of times when you've ever kind of gone for a goal, maybe you're running a marathon or something, and if you can picture yourself running across the line, you're holding the medal, you've done the job, you feel great, it was, it's a great experience, and that then quite often becomes the thing that happens. And so when we hold in our minds this idea of what aging is going to look like for us, I think it's really important to have a full picture and not just have this kind of perhaps wrinkly, shriveled kind of this that a lot of conjures up, the fragile. We are anti-fragile as well. This is the other layer to remember, is that our bodies are so incredible. And I know I've said this a few times before, so if you've ever heard me whitter on about this before, how we actually get better the more we use our bodies. Like, they actually respond to being used. Even things like arthritic joints, they actually do like to be moved. They like to have this, think of it like a dirty sponge that you're wringing out as you move it. So really thinking about, motion is lotion. You've heard me say that a million times, that actually moving things is much better than not moving things. You are anti-fragile. You get to get better as you get older on every level. How exciting is that? Like, now we can just ditch that fragile, the thing that the whole kind of weak, feeble, unable, incapacitated, that whole narrative can just be kicked to the curb. And you get to paint the picture of a life that now continues to get better on so many different levels. Really excited. It's kind of it, because also you kind of get this, I know I get these moments of like, oh, it is actually happening. And, to have this narrative that isn't doom and gloom, I think is so important. So I'm off to go and paint my picture of what my life is going to be like. Hopefully at the age of like 95, I would love to be able to still feel like I have a lot to offer. I still got a twinkle in my eye. I very much hope so. I will speak to you soon.